Hi, everybody. I'm Jen Krutzer. I'm the Director of Climate Initiatives at the Wild Center. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm calling from the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Haudenosaunee people. And thanks everyone for joining our clean call today. We do have speakers today, which is super exciting, and I'll introduce them in just a second. But I thought we could maybe quickly do any announcements, and maybe if we have a small group of why don't you have a quick round of introductions, just so you can get a sense of who's in the room, if that works for Paul and Lauren. Okay, perfect. Great. Looks like Chini, did you raise your hand? Okay.
I think that's Jim.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I'm sorry. I'm trying to track on this. Jim, go ahead. And you're on mute.
Thanks. Hi, Jen. So introductions and, announcements, introductions. So 2 is just letting people know we did get accepted for a presentation at ASTC on behalf of the Clean Network. So basically making sure that ASTC takes clean seriously and sees it as a resource. But they do want it just to be a poster, so it's like a 5-minute video, but still it puts us on the agenda and makes us recognized. I think it's good, so follow up. The other is I've been out for a bit because our team in Washington, D.C. and Montgomery County, Maryland, have been doing quite well. And just a sense of the buildings that we're selecting that we have is one is Library of Congress. They have some serious energy efficiency issues. The Capitol building itself, the D.C. Capitol Police, were very eager to support us and have us go in as soon as the public can go back in again. They loved what we're doing with the cameras out in front. And we can compare that to the Washington Monument, the White House, and NOAA's headquarters as examples of federal government programs where they are very energy efficient, and we've got them all on film. National History Museum and then National Gallery of Art are not so good, and the African American History Museum are really good. So those are there. And it goes on. There's Montgomery County as well. So the students have a lot to go to work to take action on climate change. So that's what I got. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Other announcements? Really, it's very quiet on the announcement front. Okay, well, why don't we, just because we are a small group today, I was wondering if we could very quickly just do introductions, and I will just call on people to make it fast. We're going to start with Frank G. Just name and maybe association where you're calling from today.
Okay, having trouble getting unmuted this morning. Frank Granshaw, Portland State, Portland, a Greater Portland Sustainability Education Network, and that's of course Portland, Oregon.
Awesome, thanks, Frank. We'll go to the other Frank Niepold.
Frank Niepold, NOAA Climate Education Program Manager and Coordinator, but I also wear a couple other hats. I am current a co-chair of the Clean Leadership Board and about to stand that down in sometime soon. And then also at the international level, I'm an ACE National Focal Point for the United States. So I've been leading climate education, literacy, engagement for a decade and a half. Happy to be with you.
Thanks, Frank. Wendy.
Hi, I'm Wendy Abshire. I'm a meteorologist by training. I'm in the role and care deeply about being in the role of being the education program director for the American Meteorological Society, where we predominantly focus on earth science literacy with K-12 teacher professional development as a serious part of our portfolio, as well as creating undergraduate curriculum materials, especially for non-science majors.
Thanks, Wendy. Emily.
Hi, I'm Emily Corin. I'm at Stanford in California, and thank you again so much to Lauren and Paul for joining us today to help me cross-connect entertainment education and climate communication.
Cool. Thanks, Emily. Chini.
Hi, everyone. I am with the Reading and Writing Project at Columbia University at Teachers College. We're a global literacy think tank. We do professional development, mainly on literacy, but I'm kind of focused on climate literacy. And I've also founded an organization called the Climascope Project, which is trying to make it easier for teachers to teach climate change across the K-12 curriculum.
Thank you. Amy, are you able to introduce yourself? I think you're still on there. Oh, good. There you are.
Hi, yep, I'm totally here. Just kind of awkward in this house, so just sparing you that. My name is Amy Framer. I'm the K-12 program manager at 10 Strands based in California. Good morning or afternoon, everybody.
Thanks, Amy. Jim?
Hi, let's see. So Jim Callahan, I'm a specialist in climate change education for the last 20 years. ClimateChangeEducation.org is a parent organization, and probably more related to Lauren and Paul is we do big informal education like science festivals where it has to be entertaining. That's an element of what it does, but bridging it into the schools, and there we go from California into Washington D.C. So schools like Lowell School and schools in Montgomery County. There's several schools now in D.C. That'll do that, which involve the students in action, in taking action on climate change. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. And then I think there's somebody on the phone with the 507 area code.
That would be me. This is Devardi. Hi.
Oh, hi, Devardi.
Yes, hi. I am sorry the internet is playing games, so phone is a better option. I am a science education specialist at Central Washington University, but I am coming to you from Waconia, Minnesota. That's where I remotely work from. And my interest in climate literacy has been over a decade, following all your people's work and awesome work that Clean Leadership has done. Thank you.
Thanks, Devardi. And then, well, I think I already introduced myself earlier, so I don't need to do that again. Okay. So now we're going to go right into our more formal talk today. And today joining us is Lauren Frank and Paul Falzone to talk about entertainment education behind the scenes, insights for educators. And Lauren and Paul, I'm going to let you both introduce yourselves and let us know how you'd like to proceed with the talk today. And I know you were talking earlier about some informal conversation in addition to your presentation. So take it away.
Hi, thank you so much. It's great to meet you all, and thank you for doing those introductions because it does really help to know who else is here. What we're thinking for today, we do have slides, but this is a really small group, so please jump in, ask questions. I get the feeling that you've been introduced to the idea of entertainment education before, but don't necessarily know a ton about it. So please, absolutely let us know if we should keep going or shut up and move on or whatever else so that this is as useful as possible. I am Lauren Frank. I am an associate professor at Portland State. So very excited to meet Franks, who's also here in Portland. And I'm background first in public health and then in communications. So where I come from is I've done a lot of mass media campaigns, focused a lot on persuasion. You can imagine right now that a lot of that has to do with things like persuading people to get vaccines. Climate change and climate science is another one of those areas where persuasion is really, really tough. And that's part of why we're going to be talking about entertainment education today, because it does have to be entertaining, and it does have to be not just telling somebody something and hoping that they don't sit there and tell you you're wrong a million times. So that's me.
Great, and my name is Paul Falzone. I am right now more on the practitioner end. For the last decade, I've run an organization called Peripheral Vision International, which makes social and behavior change communication and entertainment, mostly in East Africa, but increasingly around the world. And actually, it's great to be talking with you all here today. Prior to this role, I was an assistant professor at Green Mountain College, which was an environmental liberal arts school in Vermont, teaching media advocacy. So this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. So thank you for your time. And Lauren, you want to just jump in? You've got the slides there, and the
I will be sharing my screen. So I think you also all have a copy of the slides and can follow there as well. And give me one moment because it's showing weird things on my screen and I want to be able to see my notes. There we go. I think it's already in the chat as well and here on the slides, but part of the reason that Emily had asked us to come talk is that we did just publish a book. Paul's holding it up and this is it. And part of the reason we are letting you know about this is it's open access. So it's available as a free download and you can get all of the different chapters. We co-edited it. And so we have some amazing contributors who are some of the top names in entertainment education who've all contributed lots of chapters. And you can find it through these two different links in terms of finding more information and also the free digital download. So typically, when we're thinking about persuasion and we're thinking about trying to get people to learn things, all of that, we talk a lot about mass media campaigns. Those often have been things where we're trying to reach really large audiences at once, and we're trying to change knowledge, beliefs, attitudes, using mass media so that we get a really large audience and typically fairly small effects. But the idea is by reaching a whole bunch of people, even small effects can end up adding up. The problem is that those can go really, really badly. Too frequently we'll hear something where it's like, let's just throw money at this and create a campaign. Lots and lots of campaigns backfire. And there are whole bunches of reasons that that can happen. But a big one is around this idea of, if I perceive that you're trying to change my mind, and especially if it feels like what you're doing is going against my deeply held values and beliefs, then I'm going to counter argue against that, come up with all sorts of defensive reasonings and mechanisms where I'm fighting back and thinking of all of the ways in which you're wrong. And when that happens, we not only end up with psychological reactance, this feeling of like, you're threatening my freedom, you're threatening my ability to make my own choices. We actually can go even further where it can have a boomerang effect. And rather than getting me to agree with you, then I can actually go the other way and move even further from your position than I started. That's something that we've seen in climate science a lot, that there are certain, even words and phrases are highly polarizing, and that a lot of climate science messaging ends up leading not to, oh, people are now agreeing with me, but instead quite the opposite of, wow, we've just moved people even further away from each other. We're not coming together. We're not coming to consensus. What entertainment education does is try to get us sort of around that by suggesting that rather than directly going and trying to say, do this, do that, we're instead incorporating ideas into stories. And so entertainment education is the intentional placement of educational content in entertainment messages. And not all entertainment education follows storytelling, but for the most part, it does use a narrative format. And the idea is that that story or narrative structure can help overcome psychological reactance, because people aren't really thinking and processing it through by thinking in terms of, oh, you're trying to persuade me. They're instead thinking this is a great story. And then the messages become somewhat more subtle and are embedded within it. I'm going to really briefly run through an example that is not climate change, because only a few of the examples out there are actually around climate change. Paul will talk about one that sort of touches on it later. So the first example that I'll go through is more to tell you about how entertainment education usually works and the traditional theories that we use and methodology that we use to create these kinds of things. And then we'll talk about, okay, but what about when those don't work? And Paul will get into that some more. So this is an example that I worked on in India called Adaful. And it's a story that is about these 3 young kids who join together and become a detective team. And it follows the very traditional entertainment education format. And so that format is one where it's fairly long running. In this case, it was 52 episodes. And it is almost a soap opera kind of format where the whole thing is developed intentionally to be first entertaining, and we're always going to emphasize that that entertaining part of entertainment education comes first and is most important. Because the whole idea is that our audience is choosing to watch it and wants to engage with the material. And then within it, there are social change messages embedded. In this case, for Adaful, a lot of those social change messages were around gender equity. And so the very first episode, for example, was around arranged marriages and dowry and child marriage. But all of it is within this longer format of, it's a story that we're watching because we get to see cases being solved and kids having fun and all sorts of conflict and drama and other things that I watch just because I want to see it. And so a lot of the background for this comes from Bandora's social cognitive theory. He started doing research in this area in the 70s, and now his most recent up-to-date things tend to be around this 2004 idea, where essentially the idea is that our goals lead to behavior. So what we choose to do, the decisions that we make, what we learn about things, we're very, very goal-oriented, and we're consciously making choices. And so those goals can then be impacted by our expectations of what will happen if we do something. And those expectations can be physical. So, for example, if I get the vaccine, then I will be protected. They can also be social, where if I get the vaccine, then people will approve of that, and my friends and family will be glad I did. And also self-evaluative, so how I feel about myself, my own self-image. But it's bigger than that because, of course, we don't make our choices in a vacuum. And for climate science, this is especially true, where we're talking about things where my individual choices alone aren't going to make all of the difference. And so we look at the social cultural context and all of the other things that are either barriers or contributors that help me make my own decisions and create the setting within which my choices play out. One of the big ideas that he had is this concept of self-efficacy. And so self-efficacy is a feeling of, I can actually do this. And it's one of the things that entertainment education can model particularly well. Because if I watch others who I feel like I identify with, who I feel like are like me, doing something, struggling, overcoming barriers, changing over time, then I feel more like I could do the same. And so in the example of Adaful, they followed the very traditional Sabito methodology, which is taking Bandora's social cognitive theory and making really explicit recommendations for how to incorporate that. And a lot of it is about these characters who we could identify with. And so in this case, they came up with character profiles, intentionally pulling people of different genders, slightly different ages, but more than that, different social classes and castes, so that there would be this diverse possibility of modeling. Additionally, they included somebody who is more of an aspirational role model, the person we really, really want to be like. And so the idea is that we can both see that positive role model who's already doing the right behavior, but that person might not be the one that we really feel a strong connection with, like we're already like them. And so we can also feel and see characters who are more transitional, who are more like us to begin with, and we see them go through that journey that we might also copy. I have a bunch of slides and you can kind of look at these later for your reference. I'm just going to highlight a few key points from when we did an experiment looking at this. One is that in general, what we find is people are highly engaged with this kind of programming, that they're interested in watching it and actually enjoy it on their own. Similarly, they tend to talk about it with others. And so when we're thinking about persuasion, when we're thinking about learning things, so much happens through who we talk to, who we agree with. And entertainment education can very easily become something where it's not just me individually, but I'm talking to my friends and families about the programming. And then it can also end up making changes in our attitudes, self-efficacy, and beliefs. In this particular example, it was something where, for the most part, girls already had all of the beliefs. And so it was really only boys where we felt and found these changes in terms of beliefs around gender equity. So at this point, I'm going to pass it along to Paul.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk just for a minute about Medium and why we choose to use these specific tools to create change in the world. I'm going to talk about two different ways that we can, and folks have used television, but at the end of the day, it's not about the specific medium or format. Like, the idea is to amplify to your audience. One uses these tools because the audience is already engaged, they're paying attention, and often with fiction or entertainment formats, they're kind of, those blocks are less up, they're more kind of open to receiving messages. And once upon a time, I used to work in philanthropy, and a lot of what our organization worked on was marriage equality. This is in the early 2000s. And it's funny to talk to them later, they thought that maybe gay marriage would be achieved in a generation or two out. But what we saw was a very quick shift. When you talk to folks in that sphere, a lot of them say it wasn't necessarily all this nonprofit giving, it was Queer Eye for the Straight Guy. And it was the characters on reality television, the sympathetic gay characters there that kind of put someone recognizable that you care about in the home, and it would break down those barriers that one would have never met a queer person before. This is the exposure hypothesis, right? So mass media has this ability to go very broad, not very depthy, but very broad. And in the aggregate, that creates change. Especially over time, right? It cultivates consciousness at scale. There's also something called the Drench Hypothesis that certain people, though you might get small changes across the board, have really powerful responses to these stories. The first African-American female astronaut, her name is Mae Jemison, and she talks about being a little girl in the 60s and seeing the character Lieutenant Uhura on Star Trek. And this was the first time she saw someone who looked like her and her parents and her family that wasn't a maid. Right? She was on the bridge with the other folks. She was a scientist. And though that didn't send her directly into space, that kind of got her thinking like, you know, I want to do that. I could be something like that in the future. So that's kind of the opportunity of entertainment media, to go very broad, to kind of have that intense reaction in certain, you know, to activate certain individuals and to kind of shift the needle over time in the aggregate with a broader populace. So we had just talked about that Indian telenovela project. You know, that's really good in the developing world because a lot of the content's more sponsored. I'm going to talk about two other ways you can use television. The first, right here in the United States, if you want to go to the next slide, is the approach taken by the Hollywood Health and Society program, which is at University of Southern California, Annenberg School at the Norman Lear Center. And what they do is they find programs that are already popular, that are already on television, right? And then they work with the writers, they work with the producers to kind of make sure that they incorporate storylines into those already popular shows, and to make sure that they get the science right. Most of their work over the years, if I'm not mistaken, has been more in the public health realm, a lot about HIV and AIDS, whatnot. Like climate change is just a burgeoning area of interest for them, and a burgeoning opportunity moving forward as we see it in the news, right? The last few months, you've probably heard this with your friends. Climate change is suddenly real. Why? Because they're hearing about it from media. And I think that as we begin to think about transformative approaches to create that, to create a world that deals with climate change, fictional representation in popular media is going to be a huge opportunity moving forward that we haven't seen that much of, right? We're still looking forward. We're still looking at the day after and whatnot. Or was that, right, where they froze New York? We haven't seen really the edgy opportunity yet of using popular media to shift attitudes around the new world that we have to create collectively. So that's one area, especially in the United States, is embedding stories into existing popular shows. And I just want to talk about our work for a minute over the last year. If you go to the next slide, I work in Sub-Saharan Africa. And what we've seen over the last decade is that micro solar energy has led to people further down at the bottom of socioeconomic period getting access to television more. The fastest growing traditional medium in Sub-Saharan Africa is television, and the area of the world where television is growing the fastest is Africa. And it's often in those country stations, right? So folks not getting satellite television, but getting just what you can get with the rabbit ears on your television, terrestrial broadcast it's called. There's a lot of those stations, they don't have money to make their own stuff. And so when COVID hit, we kind of pivoted very quickly to take advantage of that. And we realized that science needs to be elevated. The more that you elevate science, make it understandable, make it comprehensible, and make it trustworthy, that's when you trust Dr. Fauci instead of looking at him as a conspiracy theorist or whatever the local equivalent of that is. So we created NGen, or Next Generation Television. It was Africa's first science show for kids. Africa has the largest youth population in the world by far. I think the median age is about 19 years old in Sub-Saharan Africa. So very young, norms are plastic, they're still trying to make sense of the world, and we wanted to see if we could use television as a tool to reach them about science. A lot of kids were also out of school the last year, as you know. And so we produced this quick and dirty 13 episodes on a variety of different topics. If you want to go to the next slide. And what we found was that by making it free to broadcasters, folks are hungry for it. So thus far, we've gotten it accepted to broadcast on 34 different television networks across 11 countries. And this long tail of distribution continues to unfurl. It was also broadcast here in the States on the Africa channel on cable. It's broadcast across Africa on satellite on the Africa Magic Family channel. And you know what? What's interesting is that the West was also looking for more representation in its media. So we were approached both by Common Sense Media, which is launching a new platform called Sensical, and Discovery Ed, which is, I guess, in half the classrooms in the States to acquire that content. So right now we're actually working on season 2 of the show, and it's all going to be focused on climate change, right? So first it was just general science, but this time we're really bearing down, doing more 13 additional episodes all about climate change. And what we found is we can have a really broad reach for a really small cost. Whether we have impact, that's another question. And actually, Lauren and Don Green at Columbia University are working on designing an experiment now to test the impact of the show. That's all I have. I'm mostly here just to answer questions. And Lauren, do you have anything else to follow up with?
Nope. I mean, you've got the links for the book, and the slides also included both of our contact information. I'm lfrank@pdx.edu. So opening it to questions or comments or any kind of conversation now, but also inviting you to follow up if you want.
And just to plug about the book, there hadn't been an edited collection on this since like 2004. We got most everyone who's a major theorist in the field to contribute, and they're certainly a lot smarter than I am, and they have amazing chapters in there, including one from Hollywood Health and Society, Katie Borum-Chat, who at American University, who talks about the American media sphere and entertainment. So take a look, it's free online.
Thanks, everybody. And it looks like there is some questions already. I'm going to call on Patrick because I sadly forgot to let him introduce himself earlier. I'm sorry about that, Patrick. Why don't you go ahead?
All good. Thanks, Jen. Yeah, I guess I was curious about how you're looking at impact and to learn a little bit more on that. From the statistics that you showed, there really wasn't a lot of change in your scales. And I wasn't surprised or discouraged by that because I've seen that in many different kind of peek-ins at impact in this type of work, especially when it's grading on a scale rather than looking for more qualitative responses. but I feel like one of the biggest challenges in the work, as far as looking at impact, is gauging a longitudinal effect instead of the momentary impact. And I'm wondering if you've played with that at all and thought through how to make that case beyond the statistics you offered there.
Hi, Patrick. Thank you so much for that. And thank you also for introducing yourself in the chat. Apologies for that earlier. You raised such a good question. And I think people in our field argue about this for hours, weeks. Literally, I've gone to conferences entirely devoted to this question. So it's a big question and a really, really hard one to answer. I'll give you some thoughts. I'll also say, Paul just mentioned Don Green as somebody who he and I are currently working with Paul and trying to do an experiment. He has a chapter in the book that's all about the, okay, but what are the effects and how do you actually measure this? We have a huge issue anytime we're talking about media effects. This is true for entertainment education, but it's true for any sort of broad-based thing like this, where we can do something like an experiment and then I can show actual effects and I can talk about causality. And that tends to be really important for funders and getting them on board and saying, we're going to go ahead and do this. But it's super artificial. And for instance, the one that we're planning right now in a time of COVID, it's literally going to be sending things to people's screens. Everything is remote. We're not going to be seeing people because we certainly don't want to expose anybody. But that also means like, this is not how we actually see stuff. As a result, we get really, really small effects and they're usually pretty short term. The longest ones that I've seen tend to be around the 6-month follow-up in terms of longitudinal for experiments. And we do show that some of these kinds of narrative interventions can have effects that last that long. One of my own projects, it might be on the references and I don't recall for sure, but it was Murphy et al. 2015. We did that kind of 6-month follow-up. But the problem is when we're doing something where it's an experiment, we're very, very limited in terms of length of the experiment. Over time, we get attrition, so those people end up not being like other people, and it's just really, really tough. So the flip side is we can do a lot of stuff that isn't experimental, where we're instead going after the fact and saying, hey, you watched this for real, tell us about it. But then we don't get to make the same causal claims. And similarly, you also brought up the issue around scales. There's a whole bunch of social desirability. So that thing where we did the project in India, we had ceiling effects because nobody wants to say out loud, like, yeah, no, women should not have equal access and opportunities. And yet we know that that's something that's very much still true. And we also on that particular project did do a bunch of focus groups and did get much further in. I always advocate mixed methods. I think that those kind of qualitative things are really, really useful. For the most part, funders don't want to fund that. They want statistics and they want us to be able to show sort of a return on value that is equivalent to other kinds of treatments and interventions. So everybody else can jump in on this too, but it is a big, big question that the whole field is struggling with.
And they've struggled with it the whole time. I mean, the powerful effects school of media analysis went out in the 1950s, right? I myself love George Gerbner's cultivation theory, which looks at kind of aggregate effects over time. You know, you watch more and more television, you begin to think that there's a mean world out there because all you see are cops and criminals shooting each other. But I would say this, look at the past couple of years, look at the COVID conspiracy theories, look at QAnon, look at climate change denialism over the past decades, right? These are all media effects. These are all generated purely in the media. They don't exist in real life. I can't put it on a spreadsheet exactly 1-to-1 how many hours of watching Fox News leads to that, but we know media has an effect. But whenever you try to put a gauge on it, it gets real messy, real messy.
Great, this is so interesting. I'm gonna jump right to Frank and then Jim, looks like, for questions.
So Lauren and Paul, super interesting presentation. So where I'm going on this one is there is an experiment that's already underway about media and climate change right now. And Paul, you just alluded to some of that, but there's even more because, for the longest time, youth, we would see, I do work on climate education for a decade and a half. And, I'd get asked questions about this from 7th graders and 8th graders and 10th graders and college students. The questions are starting to change. And so I'm suspicious of something. And so I'm just exploring that in the context of entertainment education. So in the past, I'd get questions, I'd send out clipboards with questions and about climate change. And, I'd get, is it too late? Are we all going to die? And that it showed up often. Every clipboard I've ever used, because I didn't want them to stand up and ask the question. I just wanted to know what's on your mind that is anonymous, as opposed to what you're willing to stand up and say in front of your peers. That's not a good situation, right? Because I'm going to get a very different question set. Now what I'm starting to see is they're answering the question. It is too late. So a nihilism and a depression and an anxiety is starting to show up. And I'm wondering, because what's in the media? When you think of climate change and entertainment, what are the places where they talk about this? A whole lot of dystopian, right? Everything has failed, and now it's about whether it's sea, which I just watched the other day, right? Or you name them all, right? Zombie apocalypse. What caused the zombie apocalypse? I mean, it's a whole range of things, but there's a lot of climate change leading to failed society. There isn't any talking about successful addressing climate change. I can't find anywhere. And actually, Emily, I'm going to call you forward because many years ago, you called me up and said, "What if we did a show about how it is to deal with climate change in a daily life?" And there's a lot of humor there. Trust me, I live it. But that show is not out there. And so the stories about us successfully addressing this related to the successful role model. We don't have any successful role models out there. Everyone's screwing up. And there are successful role models out there, but no one's seeing them. And so I know that's a wandery question, hopefully somewhere in that, but how we insert intentionality in the storyline about how climate change is moving forward, as opposed to it's failed, no one knows what to do, it's really, really bad. The scientists, and I represent the US Global Change, in climate enterprise. And it's like, let's just tell them how bad it is. And that's their solution. And I've been beating them up and I'm losing. And they just want to keep on telling us how bad it is. And I'm like, that isn't working. So what does? That's my question.
Emily, what do you got to say?
Yeah, well, I think that it's a really important point, Frank. I mean, the barriers that I hit in producing it were mostly funding barriers. And then there were some network barriers, and this is what Cheryl Slane found also within the entertainment industry, that there are barriers in perception within the industry, right? Oh God, we can't talk about this. This is too scary. If we talk about climate change, we're going to lose audience, right? So Cheryl Slane's Rewrite the Future project, I think she came on to join me to chat about that about a year ago. They were really the outliers who were willing to talk about story. Even the Hollywood Health and Society program has, structural barriers about how it can and will talk about climate change. And then there's capacity limitations of both that and the science and entertainment exchange. I hit funding production barriers. That was my biggest problem. And then I think it was really interesting that Lauren and Paul were both talking about problems with funding the research side, because even when it looked at times that I was going to get funding for the actual content production, there was always this, challenge between how much of the research do we fund versus how much of the content production do we fund. So those were really hard questions from the program development side. And then I just want to celebrate one team win here is that Cheryl Slane is moving over to Netflix in the content production department. That's new. I'm putting together a book on storytelling to accelerate climate solutions. Cheryl hopefully will be submitting a chapter to that. Both Jessica Bean and Don Haas are also expecting to submit chapters to that from this team. So that is the space where hopefully we're academically continuing this conversation from Lauren and Paul's work as we continue to try to overlap the two fields between, narrative content and climate communication. But Frank, it's hard, and I've been calling for backup on this for 2 years now. So I'm still in it, but yeah, there's a lot of barriers.
I think one good news, and I have to be careful exactly what I say about it because some of it is privilege, but Population Media Center is planning to do something on climate change. That's Bill Ryerson's, and so you can learn more about generally what that organization does. They are actually one of the only to do a very traditional EE format here in the US with East Los High. So they're currently fundraising for a hoped for series on climate change. But I think that broader question of, is it still going to be dystopian? Is it still going to end up just showing like, hey, climate change is real, but also we should all just figure we're going to die and there's nothing left for our kids? Because I think that's a big, big question. There, I highly recommend, Arvind Singhal has done a lot of work on a concept called positive deviance and bringing that into entertainment education. And this is the idea of part of the reason that so many of the stories we're seeing are negative is because when we go and look for stories, so many of them feel negative. It feels like broadly it is really hard to make change. And so instead you go and look for the outliers, those people who are managing to make change and make the entertainment education about that positive deviant, who then that becomes the story and it becomes the person who's the role model, where we feel like, oh, but maybe this is possible. And then the other thing is, when I was talking about social cognitive theory, I talked about self-efficacy. More recent work is really pushing on this idea of collective efficacy and what can we do together rather than it being just individuals. And so we're seeing that brought into the entertainment education space as well.
And I would also add, we dream our world into being in many ways. We envision a better future, and then that becomes the stories by which we kind of make certain choices. And there's very few narratives now. We know who the villains are here. There's plenty of villainy to go around, right? But there's few enough heroes, and there's few enough kind of models for resolution. And I think that's a huge opportunity, maybe for science fiction. Maybe we're still at that point where it has to be in that realm. But what can folks do, right? Because otherwise you fall into despair, nihilism, and dystopia. And when dystopia is the reality, what does utopia look like? And then work backward from that to tell a story to getting there. I don't know what utopia looks like in this scenario.
I see some hands up. I see Frank, Granshaw, and then Emily. Unless Emily, you were responding directly.
I want to jump in because I think that Lauren got it on the head of the nail with the positive outliers. And so one of the things that I see as an illustrator is I see the positive outliers, but getting them into the media examples is hard. So one of the things that one of my teams has been working on is basically a mechanism, like a feedback cycle where we can collect the positive outlier examples and then start feeding them into things. That needs more development, but I think mechanistically, especially as we get into sort of the ACE work, it provides a set of tools where we can start to collect what's working regionally and then start to provide pathways to get those stories in real time into the media examples. And I got to look at some of the network analysis stuff. Lauren and Paul, do you guys know Tom Valenti? I got a chance to check in with him about a week or two ago. And he's looking at like a network analysis perspective, which would be fun to make a follow-up to this. But
that's fabulous. He was one of the instructors when I was getting my PhD. He's amazing.
Perfect. So it was from a network analysis perspective, you have like all these little dots, Frank. And when you start to look at the positive outliers from like that, like sort of bird's eye view, actually it's really a lot easier to see what those are and how they spread as messages, which gives me kind of some hope for how we can collect and share those positive outliers for what the regional solutions for climate mitigation and adaptation are.
Awesome.
Okay, I think we have Frank and then Jim. Sorry if I'm getting things out of order, but.
Actually, Jim had his hand up first.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Frank. Go ahead, Jim.
Okay, thanks. And Frank will definitely not step on your time on this. You've got all kinds of things I want to do, so I'll try and condense it a bit here. I had this as my third question, but I'm going to move up to the front. Is the question of persuasion is like the key word actually our program is working on right now. Okay, and one is we have groups of students who have the scientific evidence of where major institutions in DC and Maryland are inefficient and can be with just changing light bulbs will make a whole building way more efficient. And we're talking Congress, and we're getting invited into it. We have the evidence, but how do we have the students learn to communicate in ways that they're taken seriously and they're persuasive? One is what they have is fun. It's amazing. We go in with videos and you can see where the energy waste is, and it blows people's mind that you can show that with infrared video, that people didn't know you could do that, and the kids took the video. But how do they not be taken as just, oh, your kids, what do you know? Or how do we not piss people off when it's not necessary? I mean, we want to teach some kids, go in there and embarrass the hell out of them. That's one technique. With some people, we're going to embarrass them. But the architect of the state capitol, we're getting the signals is they want to go energy efficient, but there's a lot of political pressure to not move, or they haven't thought about it, or they didn't even know that the Library of Congress is really dirty. But when they see it, how can we work with them and do that? So, I mean, that thing of persuasion, there's so much we want to learn from you. That's a key word, okay? If you don't mind, the other one I had was I want to make sure you all are able to real clear, what do you want from us? And I mean that in a good way. Like, I'm going to get one is you have a book that's open. We want to read it. We want to be persuaded by it. We want to learn from it. We want to take that. So if there's anything more we're missing, please say that. But it also would be like, what connections are you looking to come out of all this? I mean, there can be, we're taking information for you, things that you've learned, people you know, and I, for one, am very open to that, want to learn and do that. But is there a two-way street? Are there things that we're doing as educators? One is we have access to children like nobody else. We have access to children like nobody else. We can work with them. We can do things. But what do we have them do? What do we do stuff? And those children then could be on television. Those children could be your example of someone on a sitcom who is, thinks, and I'm trying to think about what were the examples in historically that we have. I mean, there are the out front things like All in the Family that dealt with major social issues all the time. In science, there was Cosmos that made science entertaining like never before. We have models of where we have made social issues and specifically climate, and actually that's where I got turned on to climate change. I was already a big fan of Carl Sagan around nuclear war and work with him, but when he did Cosmos about climate change, that was my subject. That just took me. That did that. I mean, I'm not the only one. But so I mean, are there ones we want to ask your calls for action? What or how do we continue to work with you, or just we want to learn from you. I mean, again, the word persuasion, how are we persuasive with our communication? That's the word that's on my mind more than anything right now.
So on the persuasion part, this is really, really tough. I literally teach entire courses just on persuasion. The short answer is we don't persuade other people. people end up persuading themselves and making up their own minds. And so we need to change our mindset from, oh, if I just had the right, perfect message, then people will come to agree with me. It really, really is a know your audience. And so in the example you gave, it's much more a one-on-one kind of thing. And it's a get to know them, have conversations with them, figure out what matters and tweak accordingly. Because as you say, different tactics are going to work for different people. And there are political things. And there's, well, do we want to use embarrassment and shame? And how do we feel about the ethics of that? And how do we feel about what's actually going to change things? And it is 100% about a know your audience. In terms of the what do we want, I can only speak for myself here. Partially, I'm just always interested in getting to know more people. Flip side is I also am a professor, so I am always interested in doing research. So should you go forward and want to do anything where you have an external evaluator or something like that, that's a big part of what I do.
On the persuasion front, I mean, remember, folks aren't rational actors. You know, economics just realized this recently and became behavioral economics, which is just social psychology. So, you know, privilege anecdote over data. Anecdote, not data, right? Stories, not numbers. Emotions, not logic. That's how you kind of persuade. Get people emotionally invested and create a narrative arc. And that's how they pay attention and that's how they remember. So, you know, I love Greta Thunberg, but she, whenever you hear her talk, she'll like give you these stats, but that's, you know, that's not what you remember about her. You remember her in the street with a sign, right? An image, an emotional image. The other stuff just kind of passes by and is the less persuasive. And you know what, also you say about access to all these kids, let them create. This is the amazing thing about digital natives is that they are, you know, active co-creators of culture online. Ask them what the solution is, because I don't have it. And as we talked about with Frank, right? Like, I don't know what that utopia is. Get them kind of imagining that better future into being early on, and visioning toward it, I would suggest. And in terms of what I want, I run a nonprofit organization. If you know anyone who likes to fund, if you know anyone who likes to fund climate change television in Sub-Saharan Africa and beyond, please let me know.
Let's see, I see Emily and then Frank G, and we just have a few minutes left. So Emily, go ahead.
This will be really quick. So on the persuasion part, from a structural perspective, entertainment education functionally is actually a complex communication strategy of which the television component is only one, it's like the tip of the iceberg, right? And so on the back end of that, what is really missing from a lot of these tools is the cross connection between physical programs and the media component. And I think that there are some functional structural pieces that we can improve as a team, because you guys run a lot of the structural functional programmatic pieces, interlinking them more actively with the television components as they go up to help people find them as pathways would be really helpful.
Frank and then Chini.
Yeah, really quickly, being a science educator, the idea of putting antidote over data and is kind of wrangles me a bit. And it wrangles me a bit because we, for a political reason, which is that we just came through four years where story and false stories were used to control people. So I guess I would feel like, you know, we need a middle ground, not over here all stories or over here all data.
Fair enough, but you know, I'm reading The Demon Haunted World now, Carl Sagan, and he has a lot to say about this as well, about how scientists are fantastic but not great communicators. I totally agree with you. Obviously, yes. The problem with like stories is not when they're lies, right? The problem that stories can be so effectively used to tell lies, and I think our strength is that we're using stories to tell truth. So don't disparage storytelling. Disparage and attack the liars who use them for ill.
Okay, Cheney. And then I think this is probably our last question or comment.
I think kind of in reading and writing curriculum, and I get really excited about all these ideas. And so I guess my question is, what are the resources or people you would recommend? Like we're working on revamping a lot of our reading and writing units at the Reading and Writing Project. I could imagine one like a utopian writing unit where you're thinking from going to dystopia to utopia. Emily Korn and I have talked a little bit about ways you can infuse kind of collaboration, but like my short question is, are there people or resources you would recommend reading or talking to develop curriculum around reading or writing? The reading one is hard because there's so much, like Frank says, so much dystopia out there and not great utopia. That's my question.
That is a tough question. I don't know a lot of the people writing in this field. So what I would recommend is in our book, there's a chapter by Martine Bowman that talks sort of about how you build a team that does this. And that is absolutely the way this kind of stuff gets done. It's that you have somebody who knows the climate science and climate education really well. And then you have somebody else who knows curriculum really well, and somebody else who knows how entertainment education and persuasion works. And you want all of them to come together. And so probably what that means is you're looking for somebody who does curriculum development and agrees with you fundamentally on the ideas, but is really, really creative and can write stories. And then you bring in okay, here's the knowledge, here's what we're trying to convey, etc. So the idea is these kinds of projects only work well when you have all of the different kinds of expertise, and you probably aren't finding them in a single person.
That's helpful, thank you.
It looks like Frank Niepold has his hand up.
Just a quick follow-up to the exchange between Frank G and you, Paul. The work by John Cook on inoculation theory related to misinformation techniques. I mean, one of the things in this is that right, stories, I got it, they are so powerful, but they're powerful both ways. They're neutral on effect, right? You can use them both for good and bad. One of the things John Cook's research and a team of others is about using the tools of lies to help people understand how lies are used powerfully and making you less vulnerable to them on any topic. But you can use climate as the topic. But I think there's something in there that is critical to this, like revealing the trick, so that you see the trick and they're like, oh, I get it. Boy, this is just, I mean, I don't know how we go beyond this call and find a place to make progress here. But it's really, 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 really important because these are very powerful tools, strategies, influences in their aggregate effect. But I mean, just a 1 hour call, exploring and like teasing us into it. But boy, I don't know how we get this going further than this. But thank you both for joining us today. I'm not closing, but just thank you for sharing your time and experience with us, because there's a lot we have here, but how we go from here, I don't know, but I don't see how we can. But Emily, you've been at this for a long time, right? And so yet we haven't.
Yeah. Well, this has been a very robust discussion and certainly sparked a lot of interest. Thank you, Lauren and Paul, so much for your time and presentation today and for everybody's thoughtful feedback and questions and discussion. This was awesome. I think that's it. We're, I think, going back to an informal discussion next week, I believe. But again, thank you for your time and I hope everybody has a great week.
Thank you all so much.
Everyone.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.